Welcome back to Second Breakfast and our ongoing coverage of A Game of Thrones, bringing you the best thoughts, theories, and literary analysis this side of King Robert's deathbed.
Oh, R.I.P. Things are looking really tough.
I mean, it's nice. So this is coming out a week before Halloween. And the old gods and the new have obliged us by giving us Ned's 13th chapter in this book.
So spooky. So many spooky moments in this chapter. There were a lot of ominous just trends and motifs and imagery. It was very fun.
It's incredibly grim.
Oh, yeah.
And without identifying too many details, Maggie and I were at an event the other day and we heard someone mispronounce the word macabre.
Oh, my God. Before we say it, comment down below. How do you think they said it? You're probably wrong. Are you ready? It was macabre. Like he's making a bracelet or something. I heard it and I just looked at you and went, oh my God.
It was shocking.
Anyway, it was very funny.
So we're gathered today to talk about A Game of Thrones. Spoilers for everything. What happened in this chapter, Eddard number 13?
Let me tell you. So Ned is dreaming, classic Ned. He's walking through the crypt at Winterfell and he hears Lyanna's voice and she says, promise me, Ned. And then her eyes bleed and then it's very cool. Then he wakes up. Don't worry. I'll dive into that dream later. It's going to be great. So he wakes up and the king's steward is knocking at his door. It's the middle of the night and he says the king wants to see Ned at once. So Ned's like, oh, shit, Robert's back from his hunt. He wants to see me right away. He makes his way over to Robert's chambers. He goes inside, and Robert is not doing well. He is gravely injured from his hunt. He had an encounter with a boar, and he is got this horrible wound from, I think, groin to nipple is how it was described.
Groin to nipple. It is a memorable wound.
It really is. So we'll just picture that for a minute.
And I think it's both tusks, isn't it?
Yeah, I think it's they did their best to sew him up and stuff, but it took him 2 days to get him back. And, they don't have penicillin or alcohol to, clean things.
Sure.
So not true alcohol. They have wine. So they're
putting leeches on the wound.
There are wine-soaked bandages on him. It's foul. It's disgusting. Anyway, so he's not doing well. And so basically Robert sends, there are a bunch of people in the room. Cersei's in there, Renly, Maester Pycelle. He sends everybody out and he just wants to talk to Ned alone. And Robert knows that he is going to die. And so he has Ned transcribe this decree that says that Ned is going to be the regent and protector of the realm until Joffrey comes of age. So for the next 4 years, because Joffrey is 12 and 16 is when you come of age in this world. Wild. But Ned, he's doing this and he can't bring himself to tell Robert the truth. Even though he had totally planned to tell him all about Jaime and Cersei, he's just this guy's in too much pain. He's dying. I can't tell him the truth.
And he knows this is the pivotal moment.
Yes, I know. It's a big moment and he can't do it.
He acknowledges it to himself. We get a lot of time inside his thoughts here.
There's a lot of inside his head. Yeah, we'll unpack a lot of that as we get into it. And so Ned leaves the room. Basically, Robert asks for milk of the poppy so he can go to sleep and die. And so that happens and Ned leaves the room and Renly pulls him aside and says, hey, I can help you. Here's what I think we should do. I think I'm going to give you a bunch of men to help fight the Lannisters. We should capture the Lannisters' children tonight so that we have leverage on them. And Ned says, no, I'm not going to do that. Robert's still alive. And also I'm not going to capture children. That's not cool. But then so he walks away and then he starts to kind of wonder, oh, should I have taken his advice? I don't know what to do. He's kind of starting to panic. And so he writes a letter to Stannis because Stannis is, of course, the rightful heir if Joffrey and the other kids are not Robert's. And he also summons Littlefinger. And so Littlefinger shows up and Ned tells Littlefinger all about Cersei and Jaime. And Littlefinger doesn't seem surprised at all. We're shocked. And Littlefinger says, well, here's what I think you should do. He says, putting Stannis on the throne will lead to war. So instead, you should just stay regent, do what Robert said, pretend like everything's fine, wed your kids to Cersei's kids.
All of your kids.
All of them, basically. And then if Joffrey proves to be a problem, then you can reveal the secret if it's convenient. And then we can put Renly on the throne. And Ned says, I'm not going to do that. That would be treason. Stannis is the heir, so Stannis needs to be king.
What does Littlefinger say?
He says, oh, I forgot I was talking to a Stark.
No, before that, when Ned says,
oh, it'll be treason. And he said, only if we're caught or something like that.
Only if we lose.
Only if we lose. That's what he says. Yeah. Oh, it's rough. And so, but Ned, doesn't want to do that. So Littlefinger says, okay, fine. But basically Ned says without saying, I need some kind of support because no matter what, even if we go through with this plan, there's going to be some backlash from the Lannisters. And so Renly is going to basically bribe the City Watch to be on Ned's side. He's going to buy their loyalty so that they can basically be Ned's new bannermen because all of his bannermen are dead. And that is where we leave things.
Yes, rickety. Dangerous.
Very
This is a
dangerous.
10-page chapter with just about 10 scenes, and it moves at such an interesting clip that I was sort of blindsided by the plot and the revelations and the schemes. But I only have one thing to talk about for this chapter. I feel like I could have done my normal thing for those, but when it becomes too obvious, when the thoughts come too quickly, I start to resist them.
Sure. Okay. I've got a couple things. Do you want me to start with one and then, or would you rather just start with yours?
I think I'd like to get mine out there.
Okay.
I think it might be a good jumping off point for some of the more granular analysis.
Let's do it.
So the first thing that hit me, because I opened the book to the wrong page, and I saw the line about the king killed by a pig. That was, once the chapter starts, you know that's where it's going.
For sure.
But that was rattling around in my head the whole time here. And the first kind of brush thought that I had there is the distillation echo. Because we spent last week with the Dany chapter talking about Viserys' death.
Yes.
So now we have another death of another weak king. So Robert and Viserys, that's who I want to sort of put on a pedestal and compare and contrast here for a minute.
I like that. And we did make some of those comparisons last week.
Sure.
Not knowing that this next chapter was going to be when Robert died. That's
I
pretty
didn't
cool.
realize it was that pointed or that juxtaposed in the larger narrative. And I like this sort of real-time eulogy we get of both of these guys as we see them pass into history and out of the story, because neither man at all lives up to his sigil or his house. We talked last week about Viserys not living up to being the dragon.
Right. Dany even says it out loud, or to herself, but out loud to us. Yeah.
And here we have Robert not living up to his crown. It's less about the stag. It's more about the crown and his position.
Yeah.
So they're both these failed kings, but even more than that, if you look at their posture, how they rose to their current role, they're both failed conquerors. Where Robert conquered the Seven Kingdoms, but immediately got eaten alive by the Lannisters, to the point where he's not leaving any children.
Right.
And of course, Viserys is a failed conqueror in that he didn't reconquer the Seven Kingdoms.
Right, he lost the Seven Kingdoms, yeah.
But I like the parallel there, because they're both failed conquerors in different ways, and in different ways, neither of them is leaving an heir.
Oh.
Viserys doesn't have kids, and Robert doesn't have true-born children.
Yeah, he's got a lot of bastards.
Who
but
could legitimately sit the throne by all the rules and decrees that we have.
Right, interesting.
So if these are the similarities between these two guys, what are the differences? And I want to open it to you here. Just jump in if you have any that you think of. Because the only one that really jumped out at me is that Viserys does not see his death coming.
Yeah, that's true. I mean, Robert is a lot smarter than Viserys. Viserys is a total idiot.
They're both
I think that's the biggest difference.
Yes, but we've called Robert an idiot plenty of times.
It's more that he's just stubborn. But he at least is not a total... I mean, he is successful in his rebellion. He was this great warrior and very intelligent and very smart and diplomatic and always stubborn and set in his ways, but knew what he was doing. And now he's kind of gone to seed a little bit, but he's never been as mentally unstable as Viserys.
I feel like George R. R. Martin sets these guys up in exactly the same way, where they're both drunk on Westerosi wine. And
I like that.
But Viserys' death happens incredibly quickly. He doesn't see Drogo melting the belt and then pouring the thing over his head. It's very, very quick when his death begins.
True.
Robert's is much more protracted, where yes, there's the surprise attack of the boar. In the same way, Drogo kind of grabbing Viserys and turning the tables is sort of a surprise attack. But there's much more time in between Robert's fatal wound and his eventual death.
Sure. Well, and he realizes why. Sorry, I feel like I just stepped on what you're about to say.
No, please.
Well, he realizes what he's done wrong. He recognizes, I shouldn't have gone after that boar. I drank too much. I shouldn't have tried to take it on alone. And extending beyond that, as he's talking to Ned, one of the things to talk about is, you were right. I shouldn't have set out the hit on Dany, or Daenerys, whatever. He doesn't know her as Dany. And the gods are punishing me for this mistake that I've made. We need to undo it. He's recognizing a lot of the problems of his style of rule or lack of ruling and his, mistakes and foolishness. Whereas Viserys never once recognizes a single mistake that he's made.
Yes. And there's a moment where Robert calmly and explicitly acknowledges that he's about to die. Mm-hmm. And I don't think Viserys ever has that moment of clarity.
No.
So that does speak to Robert's intelligence beyond what Viserys had. But yes, I'm glad you kind of threw the spotlight on that.
Well, the other difference is that Viserys is still quite young. I forget how old he is, but he's by our standards, he's a teenager, and Robert is in his mid-late 30s, so he's much older, especially in this world.
In the way Viserys calls out to Dany when he's about to be killed, there isn't that self-reflection and kind of sobered regret that we get from Robert here when he does try to pull back the hit on Dany. That is, I think, a testament to his character.
Yes.
And this is where the ball started rolling for me, was this lasting impression. What is the lasting impression of these two guys, Viserys and Robert? Is it the moment of their death, the fantastic, memorable iconography of their deaths, one of them given this perfect, almost poetic molten crown, or the other one in this drunken fight with a boar? Are those the things that are going to flash into our memory when we hear these names through the rest of this series? Or is it that last kind of quiet moment you get from each of these guys, which reveals something about their temperament, what we see in the last conscious decisions they make before they die? Because for me, at least in these last two chapters, those felt like more of the defining moments. When I think of Viserys now, the thing that I condemn him for in my head is him poking pregnant Dany in the belly with his sword.
Yeah.
That level of cruelty and rage and threat against the one person who's tolerated and accepted him and kept him alive through most of this book. And for Robert, I think of that moment of penance. I think of him having that conversation with Ned, basically dictating his last will and testament, where he indirectly admits to most of his failures and general incompetence.
Yeah.
And this kind of challenges my priors about Game of Thrones, about the whole series of books and, of course, the TV show. This is a series, whenever you talk to people about it, it's all about the shocking deaths.
Right.
All about the unexpected twists and carnage
it's the Red
and
Wedding,
gore.
and it's Ned,
But if it's all about death, and I think it kind of is.
Yeah.
I think the more interesting question to talk about in the sort of analysis we like to do, and I don't know if we've had this conversation yet, I want to figure out how those deaths define these characters.
Yeah,
because
that's true.
The death is the shorthand. It is the first thought. When you think about Ned, you think about him getting his head cut off.
Right.
When you think about Robb, you think about the Red Wedding. When you think about Catelyn, you think about the Red
When you
Wedding.
think about Bran, you think about his almost death,
Exactly.
His attempted murder, yeah.
This is the classic shorthand for these characters. But I was very taken by the posture of this chapter, which is maybe more about death than any chapter we've had thus far. And so much of the activity of this chapter was about the aftermath. What happens after an important character dies, the next steps. I mean, it's just a parade of scheming vultures. Every conversation Ned has in these, roughly 10 chapters, it's all these vultures trying to plan what happens next.
Right, before the death has even happened.
Sure, it's Cersei, Littlefinger, Varys, Stannis, Renly. They're all kind of planning ahead. They're looking at the next. They're continuing the Game of Thrones beyond any of its, fallible, expendable players. But our POV character, our number one POV character for this entire book, Ned, he ignores all of that to his peril and focuses on facilitating those last moments and decisions of Robert's life.
Right. And he even says to at least one, if not multiple people, Robert might live. Like, he may not die.
Sure.
Like, I don't think he really believes that, but he's still allowing that possibility. Whereas everybody else knows, he's absolutely dead.
But instead of doing the smart thing or the tactical thing, he carves out all of this time, this really important, formative time that sort of sets the stage for everything else falling to shit in the rest of the book. He sets aside this entire chapter to create some real-time legacy, to try to help his friend, to spend time with his dying friend. And it reads to me as something incredibly warm. It's this futile bid for control. He's trying to make space for Robert's agency and dignity around his death, instead of just moving on with the headline and scheming around for next steps.
I see.
And if we zoom ahead, because I know we're getting, 2/3 of the way through the book, we're setting up the end game now.
Not quite, but we're getting there, yeah.
We're getting there for Ned's death as well. I know we're more than halfway.
Oh, yeah, we are.
And if we zoom ahead and look at the book as a whole, I think you can view the decision that Ned makes in this chapter to be his last meaningful decision as well.
Yeah.
In the same way it is where we get Robert's last decision to make this will and testament and talk to Ned here, because Ned is ceding his advantage. I mean, Renly looks at the camera and says this, you're letting the Lannisters take the lead. They are going to outfox you here. But this is Ned's pivotal choice. This is the last choice of both of these men, and I was so struck by the fact that it is born out of love. And it's not about being tactical. It's not about playing the Game of Thrones, you win or you die. It's not about that. It's him basically holding his friend's hand and having a last conversation.
Right.
And so much of the conversation we have about this series is that grimdark label. And I thought the posture of this being born out of love, this moment of warmth, what a counter argument to that label.
Right. Well, and it's interesting because we've talked a lot about how Ned doesn't really seem to recognize his own agency and often does things that don't feel like he does things not because they feel like a choice, but because they feel like what he has to do. And I've even talked about how he doesn't ever consider what he truly wants. And I think this is really the first time he does that, both in regards to his love for Robert and also when he's thinking about the idea of going home. I really like the way you've laid this out, because I think so much of our discussion about Ned is about his death, throughout this whole book. Understandably, it's an important part of his character and how this story sets off and moves. But that is so much how we have defined him, is by, how he dies and why does he die? How does he get where he gets? And we're trying to figure out when's the turning point? When's the point of no return? Does he recognize that he's doomed? We talked a lot about that. It's interesting that here he's not really thinking about things in that way.
No, it's an incredibly, I keep using the word warm, but there's all this mustache twirling around him, that litany of people I named who are doing all of this vulture kind of scheming. But beyond all of that, if you look at all the in-between kind of quiet moments and conversation topics in this chapter, it's full of tiny moments of humanity and rays of light that challenge this grimdark label. They're talking about penance and charity and forgiveness and regret and reflection. Like you just spotlight talking about Winterfell. They're talking about the longing for family, hope, principle, honor, humility. There's something beautiful and unexpected about this chapter, which could be the final escalation into a blowout, miserable, bloody finale of a big high fantasy book. But I thought there was an incredible warmth here. Yeah. And I don't know if it matters that all of those things I just listed are fatal mistakes in King's Landing, and that they directly lead to the death of Ned and a million other characters.
This choice or lack of choice that he makes here is essential to his losing.
If there is one bumper sticker point to any story ever written, and I don't think there is, I don't think this is George R. R. Martin wagging his finger and saying, well, if you're sentimental, you'll die. That's not the point of this. But I was so struck by the prominence of these gentle human themes. And I find the circumstances around the deaths of King Robert and Viserys Targaryen, I find the circumstances, once we actually read them, much more memorable and defining than the deaths themselves.
Yeah.
I feel like I'm changing my relationship with death in this series.
That's really interesting. Yeah, it kind of gives us a moment, a chance to really see these people for who they truly are, I guess, and really understand them and these sort of defining characteristics of them outside of the ways in which they die. That's really interesting.
I remember when we talked about the prologue, the first episode we did of this whole series at the beginning, I think the beginning of this year or the very end of last year.
Yeah, it was in December of last year, yeah.
And we talked about death from the first moment. We talked about the White Walkers as death personified, as being these walking symbols that would herald this being a topic of conversation in every subsequent chapter. And I think that's held true. But I feel my relationship with that theme evolving and deepening here as we see people start to actually die.
Sure.
I'm wondering what's going to happen when we get to Ned's death.
Yeah, me too. Well, and in this chapter, there are so many ominous, moments and images throughout that really remind us that this world, the threat of death here is constant and apparent and visceral, and it really affects people. I think that's what leads to a lot of the mustache twirling, backstabby stuff like you were talking about. This is where we first get to see Maegor's holdfast, which is always fun, which was fun to read after having done all the Fire and Blood stuff.
Totally.
But we see multiple times descriptions of the spikes on the ground, like that are like between, you know, that are on the ground underneath the bridge between Maegor's Holdfast and the rest of the castle, and like the King's Guard stationed outside Robert's chambers, and even the stink of death that's inside Robert's chambers, and just this constant threat and thought about death. And Ned even thinks about the line Cersei says, "You play the Game of Thrones, you win or you die." It's there so often, and the way that people react to that threat of death and that possibility, I think, is really definitive and interesting.
Even the way the chapter opens, I mean, beyond the distillation echo of two kings dying in 2 chapters, I mean, we start the chapter with Ned being like visited by 3 ghosts and being haunted by dead relatives throughout this whole chapter, which is about another more or less relative dying.
Yeah. Let's talk about these ghosts that he's visited by, because I was thinking a lot in this chapter about Lyanna. Because Ned is reflecting on Lyanna and the "promise me, Ned" line that she famously, asks of him multiple times here. And I was trying to figure out why. But first, maybe how we can try and figure it out together. I don't have an answer, so we're going to figure it out together. I'm going to go through all the times he thinks about it, or that her death or her promise or her plea is referenced. First, of course, we get the dream where she's described as wearing, not her actually, but the statue of her down in the crypt at Winterfell. She's described as wearing a garland of pale blue roses, and her eyes wept blood, which is so ominous and terrifying and freaky and delightfully fun to imagine. And then she says, "Promise me, Ned," kind of in his head, and then he wakes up. We also, when he gets to Robert's chambers, Ned is sort of thinking to himself, 3 men in white cloaks, he thought, remembering, and a strange chill went through him. That's a reference to that memory/dream he had a few chapters ago, where he's remembering standing outside of the tower where Lyanna died, and the 3 Kingsguard come up, and like it's like the 3-on-7 fight. Remember that? So I was like, so he's thinking about that moment again, and that's like an indicator of something bad is about to happen, something life-changing and bad is about to happen. And then, of course, when Robert is talking to Ned, Robert asks Ned to serve the boar that he killed, the boar that attacked Robert, but Robert did successfully kill. He says, "Serve the boar at my funeral feast. Eat the bastard. Promise me, Ned."
With an apple in its mouth.
Yeah, incredible. So Robert says the same thing, "Promise me, Ned." And then Ned reflects on Lyanna saying, "Promise me, Ned." And then even this one's a little more subtle, but when Littlefinger is talking to Ned about Stannis, Littlefinger says, "Seat Stannis on the Iron Throne, and I promise you the realm will bleed." So I think
I didn't catch that one.
And that may not be intentional. That might just be me looking, picking and choosing.
That. Sure.
But I think that the promise is an interesting word choice. So he's thinking about Lyanna before this chapter even begins. He's thinking about it before and during his conversation with Robert, and he's by extension thinking about it after, when he's talking to Littlefinger. So what's going on there? I think one answer could be that he's thinking about just this idea of duty, of like doing what his sister asked him to do, doing what his king asked him to do, thinking about, he's preoccupied very much with, should I tell Robert the truth about Cersei and Jaime? And he's thinking about that. So maybe that's something that's on his mind. I think it could also be about bastards, because Jon, the whole "promise me, Ned" is promise me you'll keep Jon safe and protect him, right? So the way that Ned has chosen to protect Jon is by telling this lie that he's a bastard. And we also see Ned thinking about Robert's bastards in this chapter, thinking about, because there's a moment where Robert asks Ned to protect his children, and Ned tries to justify in his brain. He's like, "Well, your children aren't your children, so how can I answer this truthfully? I'm going to think about your bastard children, and I'll do my best to protect them," because poor guy's got to justify it somehow.
Right.
So he's thinking about bastards there. But I don't think that works, because before he even gets to talking to Robert about his bastards, he's thinking about Lyanna. So I don't think the bastard thing is really there. I mean, you're welcome to disagree.
No, that's interesting. Yeah, I like the idea that Robert's sort of recanting and saying, we don't have to kill this young Targaryen child. Maybe that makes Ned feel better about the other sort of big lie that he's perpetuating.
Sure.
Because he is kind of harboring a young Targaryen in Jon.
Well, right. So this is where I was thinking about Jon very specifically. Like, not only why is he thinking about Lyanna, why is he thinking about Jon? Like, he's not just reflecting on Lyanna's death and how terrible that was, and now this other person who he loves, Robert, who was connected to Lyanna as well, is dying. He's more thinking about like the line, promise me Ned. That's coming up over and over again.
Yeah.
So that means it's about Jon specifically. So I was thinking, if he's thinking about kings dying and heirs and who's the rightful heir to the throne, is he thinking about Jon as a potential rightful heir to the throne?
Well, he's so strict about who's technically has the best claim to the throne,
Right.
who's the right heir.
Right.
So yeah, I mean, you'd have to sort of ignore Robert taking over, and then you'd go back
Well,
to...
right. And I'm not sure if that works because Ned seems really set and like sure about Stannis as the rightful heir. Like
Sure.
he seems very focused on the Baratheons have the throne, so Stannis is the next heir. But
Maybe he's aware that Jon would be a claimant.
maybe that's more what it is. Yeah. And he's kind of stressed about that and stressed about that
Sure.
secret coming out, or maybe stressed about, am I doing the right thing by not telling anybody about this and just going on with the Baratheons
Yeah.
being on the throne? I was interested in that.
Because you mentioned duty before, which is
Uh-huh.
fascinating because he has this overriding... I mean, you can see how heavy it is on his shoulders, the weight of this obligation he has to Lyanna. And in the same way, every time he has a conversation with someone else about how he's hating this job working for Robert and King's
Yeah.
Landing,
Yeah.
you see the weight of that obligation.
Yes.
But you take the obligation you have to the dead loved one almost more seriously. It's more grave. It's more concrete. It weighs heavier on you
Right.
than your job.
Sure.
So I think as Robert dies and transitions into that almost Lyanna role of watching over Ned's shoulder, I think he's feeling the duty he has to Robert change and atrophy into that same sort of tectonic weight that the obligation to Lyanna has.
Right. And especially because like this is the other possibility is beyond just like duty and honor. It's also maybe about like secrets and keeping secrets because Lyanna,
Which he hates.
yes, because Lyanna has asked Ned to keep this secret. That's what she's asking him to promise is that he'll keep this secret versus Robert. Ned is keeping a secret from Robert. He's not telling Robert the truth about Jaime and Cersei. And he has this hugely, like both of these secrets, the secret about Jon and the secret about Jaime and Cersei, these are hugely important, like catastrophically, astronomically important secrets that he has to hold back and doesn't know where to put them or who to tell. And he's sort of panicking about that. So I thought maybe that's also what's kind of going through his mind. So it's like this reverse of, well, I'm keeping a secret for Lyanna, but I'm keeping a secret from Robert, and both of them are dying and or have died, and so now they're both weighing very heavily on me.
And if this chapter is the opportune moment where Ned could have, I mean, his last chance to tell Robert that his children are not his children, how does that change into this obligation he now has to Robert after he dies? Is he, I mean, does duty bind him to never tell anyone that they're
Right.
not legitimate, or would duty tell him to tell everyone?
Yeah, right.
I think
And
he's kind of grappling with that,
I
too.
think so too. I mean, he ultimately decides he's going to tell everybody, and Stannis has to be the heir. But he's still, you see him second guessing that, and you see him questioning that, and sort of not flailing. Ned never really flails, but he's not very. He gets less and less sure of himself. I think there's a final possibility here.
Oh, okay.
And this might be a little too woo woo and maybe not correct, but it's an interesting idea. So again, to think about Jon, because you made a lot of connections to Robert and Viserys because we just had this fantastic Dany chapter. And one of the things we talked about a lot in that Dany chapter was this prophecy of the stallion who will mount the world, and how we extrapolated that and connected that to the prince that was promised, who is of course Jon. And so I was thinking about Jon as like, if we just had this Dany chapter where we are, if you know Jon's secret, if you know Lyanna's secret, you are invited to think about Jon as the stallion who will mount the world, because we know it's not going to be Dany's son, because Dany's son will die. So who is it going to be? It's going to be Dany's nephew / Ned's nephew. And so it's funny, they share a nephew. How cute. But so, and of course in this chapter we think about Dany, and Robert asks Ned to undo his, death sentence on Daenerys. So Daenerys is being given a new life, and like there are new possibilities. So I thought maybe, like, why is Ned having this dream about Lyanna? Why, like, he's thinking about her because there are things that are reminding him of her and her death and this secret that he's carrying. But even before any of this happens, he's having a dream about it. And he's had a dream about it recently. Like, we saw that a few chapters ago. So why is that happening? Well, if we want to, like, we've never fully understood the sort of divine rules of this world, how the gods work, how dreams work, how any of this happens, but it's fun to explore. Maybe if we're thinking about the stallion who mounts the world, the prince that was promised, maybe there's some divine intervention or sort of recognition of or endorsement of Ned having this dream about Lyanna and therefore about Jon. Do you know what I'm saying? Like maybe if Ned is thinking about who's going to save the realm, who's going to save Westeros, because we're about to be in this like free fall, really unstable place, who's going to unite us, who's going to bring us to victory, but the stallion who will mount the world. Do you know what I'm saying?
Interesting.
So I wonder if that like piece is meant to be put into Ned's mind and he's meant to act on it, and instead he doesn't and then it doesn't go well.
Sure. Yeah, I don't know if he's equipped to parse that number of tea leaves.
Right. Yeah. And so I don't know. And maybe that's not even for Ned. Maybe that's more for us. And as the reader, I don't know. But I think there's some sort of connection there.
It kind of pulls back to the Macbeth thing, where it's one of the things that I get every time I read Macbeth, I think I get more out of this idea, is how the first time you read it or you see it on stage, you believe in the magic because you see the witches walking out there.
Yeah.
And I think the next time you engage with this story, you question that. Yes, the witches are these three women who are there, but you start to question how true all of it is, or how much of it is brought to pass by the actions of these men.
Right, because you've seen what's happened already.
You see how much the prophecy affects them and informs them or confirms their bias or makes them feel invincible, which empowers them to do these things that will then, like, how much of a self-fulfilling prophecy versus just sort of this, like the Felix Felicis chapter in Harry Potter, how it weighs on them and enables them in different ways. And I think these prophecies, whether it is the prince that was promised, we see different ones that are similar through different cultures. We're only going to get more of that when Melisandre gallops into town in the next book.
Right.
But you see how that enables and empowers and kneecaps people with what they think is possible. And Ned has these sort of abstract gods that I don't think inform him in that same way. So he's more thrown by these prophecies, these faded, he has his clean principles. He has his moral aphorisms. The man who passes the sentence swings the sword. He's running out of clear moral rules to apply to this situation. And I think that's why he is flailing.
Yeah. No, I like that. Yeah. So I don't think that Ned is meant to interpret what the gods are trying to tell him and he does it wrong. I don't think it's quite that clean, but it's interesting that those things are purveying and permeating throughout all of this.
They're swirling around him.
Yeah. It was just, I was so struck by like, why is he thinking so much about Lyanna? And I don't have a clear answer, but I think it's maybe a combination about secrets and the stuff about Jon. Like there's
obligation to
there.
the dead. Yeah, I do think Jon factors into it. I'm enjoying you spotlighting Jon these last few weeks.
Well, and guess whose chapter is next? Jon.
You cheated.
I did. I turned the page. Oh no. So I just, especially because we just had this Targaryen checkpoint and we talked about Jon and Bran and Dany all having really significant roles within those Targaryen checkpoints like we talked about.
Song of Ice and Fire.
Right. So I'm excited for that. And I want to continue tracking Ned's preoccupation with this promise to Lyanna, and by extension, Jon, throughout the rest of his life.
No, totally. I love opening that door, and I'm going to look for that next week.
Yeah.
Excellent.
It was a lot of fun. I know I said I had two things. I kind of already got into the stuff about Ned and not having a choice already. So that's really all I have. It is interesting that he does really dwell on he wanted to go home to Winterfell. He wanted to see Rickon and Bran and Robb because, like I said, in the past, he never considers what he wants. And now he is considering what he wants, but it's a little too late. But it's interesting that that's the moment he really sort of lets his guard down and stops thinking about what he has to do and just thinks about, I wish I could go home.
Well, I think part of that is, what's that line from the Night's Watch when your watch is ended? Him being this knight, guarding the realm for Robert, that watch is about to end. And he doesn't know what his next role will be. So I think this is a naturally reflective transitional moment.
Sure. And I think it's also him sort of thinking he's going to be rewarded for sticking to what's right. Because this is in the context, him expressing his wants, in his mind to himself, are in the context of, once Stannis is on the throne, Stannis is going to pick a new hand to the king. It's not going to be me. So I get to go home. I'll be free to do what I want and be with my family. And you're like, oh, Ned, like that's not what's going to happen. There was a great moment where he thinks to himself, my regency will be a short one. And I was just thinking, you got that right. It sure will, buddy boy. So it is sad that he feels like he doesn't really have a choice in what's going on. He's like, well, it has to be Stannis. It's not a choice. Stannis is the heir. There's nothing we can do about that. Stannis will be on the throne. I get to go home. And you're just like, Ned, no, that's not what it's going to be at all. And it's painful to watch.
It's sad all around. I'm excited to see what happens next week in the John chapter. That might be John 5 or 6. We haven't got many.
I think it's John
of them yet.
6. I think we've had 5. So
excellent.
Whereas this was Ned 13. So
and if you want even more Westeros coverage from us, of course, we did that Fire and Blood series over on Patreon, blowing through that whole history of the Targaryen clan, which is the source material for House of the Dragon, but it has 50 other eras in there, and kings and conquerors and deaths and tragedies. So much fun. That was, what was it, 12 episodes we ended up doing?
12 volumes,
And those are big boys. Those are an hour and a half of just huge sweeping literary analysis. They took forever to prep for.
They were so fun.
I'm incredibly proud of that series. And again, seeing things like Maegor's Holdfast pop up in this chapter, I have an exponentially deeper, more layered understanding of this world for having that history. Even when the Gold Cloaks are invoked in this chapter, I think about Daemon. I think about them being set up. So if you want that more fractal understanding that we've kind of gathered by working through Fire and Blood, that series is over there on Patreon. $2 a month. You can support the show and get access to our entire growing back catalog of bonus episodes, which also includes all of our breakfast buffet episodes. That's our roundup series, usually going through 3 works of art that have touched us, moved us, or challenged us in some way. Thank you very much for listening, and we'll be back on Tuesday with another brand new episode.